Just a few days ago, President Donald Trump announced the development of the largest American warship since World War II, the Trump class of battleships. Now, this new warship is set to be packed to the brim with some of the most potent weapons the United States has ever brought to bear, including a few that don't even exist yet, providing America's Navy with an immense amount of consolidated firepower. This revelation came on the tail of another new warship announcement, with the Navy also moving forward with a new frigate based directly on the Coast Guard's largest cutter, the Legend class. Now, these small surface combatant ships are meant to provide the U.S. Navy with more dispersed firepower, taking on lower risk missions that don't warrant the involvement of a larger destroyer, or providing supplemental firepower to open ocean formations like carrier strike groups. Now, both of these new ships are meant to help the American Navy bolster its fleet numbers and close at least some of the numerical gap between China's rapidly expanding naval forces and America's rapidly aging fleet, while also serving as catalysts for new investments into America's shipbuilding infrastructure that has really been in decline for decades now. The goal here is simple: new warships and new weapons, delivered on time and on budget to help grow the naval fleet, even as some of its most powerful Cold War vessels age into retirement. But it's in that naked pursuit of solving these problems that the Navy now runs the real risk of missing the forest for the trees. Or, in other words, American leadership seems to be so focused on checking these boxes that they're losing sight of why these boxes needed checking in the first place. The Navy doesn't need more ships just to say it has more ships. It needs more ships to provide essential combat capacity in far-flung and often widely dispersed battle spaces around the world. In particular, it needs a big boost in vertical launch system cells capable of carrying anti-air and ballistic missile interceptors, long-range land attack cruise missiles, and more. And to be honest, that doesn't really seem to be what this new Golden Fleet plan is set to provide. So let's talk about America's new frigates and battleships, the capabilities that they're set to provide, and the very big challenges they'll need to overcome. I'm Alex Hollings. Welcome to Firepower. Ground news helps you stay on top of what's going on in the world while also helping to see right through common forms of media bias and the sensationalism that's become so common today. Now, ground news does that by compiling stories from outlets all over the world and sticking them all into one easy-to-read feed, making it easier than ever to not just stay on top of the news trends, but also to see differences in how stories are presented. You can even choose specific topics that you want to stay on top of, like AI or the F-35 or the military as a whole. Poland recently announced active talks with Ukraine to exchange MiG-29 fighter jets for access to some drone and missile tech that Ukraine's developed since the Russian invasion. And Ground News has already gathered coverage of this story from 21 different outlets, including at least 3 left-leaning and 2 right-leaning ones. And here on the right side of the screen, you can see the bias distribution and factuality ratings for coverage of this story, with about 50% of outlets covering this story showing a left-leaning bias, and about half the outlets reporting on it rated high for factuality. And Ground News also shows you vital information about these outlets along with their headlines, like their political bias, their factuality rating, corporate ownership, or government affiliations. And I love the Ground News For You tab that compiles stories for me that I know will be right up my alley because they're based on topics I've chosen. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and it can be for you too. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or follow the link in the description below to get 40% off their Vantage plan. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that'll help you stay on top of things. On Tuesday, President Trump, along with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Navy Secretary John Phelan, announced their plans to field America's largest surface combatant warship since the legendary Iowa class that first set sail back during World War II. Now, unlike past battleships, which were designed and built around their massive deck guns, this new type of battleship will be designed and built around vertical launch missile cells, capable of deploying air defense interceptors like the SM-2 and SM-6, anti-ballistic missile interceptors like the SM-3, long-range conventional and nuclear-armed cruise missiles, and the Navy's new hypersonic conventional prompt strike weapon. As the Navy put it in their released fact sheet, and I quote, "The battleship will be capable of operating independently, as a part of a carrier strike group, or commanding its own surface action group, depending on the mission and threat environment. With the ability to provide forward command and control for both manned and unmanned platforms, the battleship will be a critical component in executing the Navy warfighting concept." Now, according to documents released by the Naval Sea Systems Command, this new battleship will be between 830 and 880 feet long, with a beam or width of between 105 and 115 feet, giving it a similar footprint to America's legendary Iowa class, though the Trump class won't sit as deep in the water, with a draft of 24 to 30 feet as compared to the Iowa's 37 to 41. And as a result, the Trump class battleship will be a fair bit lighter than the Iowa, displacing around 35,000 tons versus the largest Iowa's 61,000 tons when fully loaded. Nonetheless, that would still make it more than 3 times larger than the heaviest Arleigh Burke-class destroyers in service today. Now, weapon systems on the Trump class have been divided into 3 sections: the main battery, the secondary battery, and a defensive battery. The main battery will include the currently in development nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missiles, or SLCM-Ns, a 12-cell conventional prompt strike missile module for hypersonic missiles, and a total of 128 Mark 41 vertical launch system cells for those various interceptors and surface strike weapons we talked about. The secondary battery departs from these more conventional weapon offerings to include a 32 megajoule railgun with high-velocity projectiles, which will need to be developed and fielded, 2 300 kilowatt to 600 kilowatt directed energy weapons or lasers, which are in active development, and 2 more Mark 45 5-inch naval guns. And finally, the defensive battery will include 2 RIM 116 rolling airframe missile launchers for close-in air defense, 4 optical dazzling interdictor lasers, or ODINs, meant to dazzle the sensors of drones and missiles to make them lose target track, 2 unmanned counter-drone systems, and 4 30mm guns. According to USNI News, this new battleship would be powered by a combined gas turbine and diesel-electric propulsion system capable of pushing this massive warship up to speeds in excess of 30 knots. That's about 35 miles per hour, making it just as quick as a smaller destroyer and plenty capable of keeping pace with carrier strike groups. Now, initial plans call for fielding 2 of these new battleships, the first of which will be named the USS Defiant, which does my Star Trek heart some good. But the president also indicated that the class could eventually grow to 10 or even more vessels. These supremely outfitted command ships would then become something of a sibling to America's 11 in-service supercarriers, providing significant forward-deployed offensive firepower in hotspots all over the globe. Or, as Navy Secretary John Phelan put it, quote, "When a conflict arises, you, the president, are going to ask not 1, but 2 questions. Where are the carriers? And where are the battleships?" And this is where I need to step in with an important disclaimer. I work really hard to keep my analysis apolitical, meaning I'm focused on the challenges facing the American defense apparatus and the efforts to overcome them, absent any kind of political lens. A good idea is a good idea, and a bad idea is a bad idea, regardless of which side of the aisle they come from. And while I won't deny that a new missile-packing battleship could provide Uncle Sam with a much-needed boost in forward-deployed firepower, I am genuinely concerned that these new warships, especially when considered through the scope of the Navy's overall fleet structure, could indeed be a bad idea. These ships meet all the high-level, publicity-grabbing needs that the general public recognizes as important for the Navy, but in a way that seems to ignore the more complex and nuanced reality of actual combat operations. They're simple solutions to complicated problems that feel like they were born out of spreadsheets and slide decks rather than genuine warfighting strategy and experience. And again, this is not a political take. Through the macroscope of geopolitics, politicians come and go, but international competition is forever. So, what's my problem with President Trump's new battleship? And what does the Navy's newly announced frigate even have to do with it? Well, to some extent, it really all centers around VLS cells. The Mark 41 Vertical Launch System, or VLS, really should be seen as the backbone of the U.S. Navy's air defense and long-range strike capabilities. These missile launchers come in 8-cell modules, making it feasible to equip a single warship with anywhere from 1 module with 8 weapon cells to 16 modules with 122 missiles and interceptors. These cells, which come in 22-foot tactical length or 25-foot strike missile length, can accommodate a wide variety of weapon systems, including long-range surface strike weapons, like the Tomahawk cruise missile that can reach out beyond 1,000 miles. Or they can launch surface-to-air interceptors like the SM-2 and the wildly capable SM-6, which is the only in-service interceptor rated to bring down some types of hypersonic threats. They can launch ballistic missile interceptors like the SM-3 and even anti-submarine weapons like the RUM-139 vertical launch anti-submarine rocket. While most weapons fit 1 per cell, some, like the evolved Sea Sparrow missile interceptor, can actually be quad-packed, cramming 4 of these missiles into a single cell. These long-range weapons work in conjunction with the warship's powerful sensor array and the Aegis combat system to provide an incredible amount of precision-guided firepower. In fact, most of the other weapon systems carried by modern warships at this point really tend to be defensive in nature, meant to protect the vessel so it can bring those VLS-based missiles to bear. Today, the U.S. Navy operates 3 classes of surface combatants, all of which are armed with either Mark 41 VLS modules on their interior, or more recently, Mark 57 VLS modules that function the same but are mounted on the sides of a vessel instead. And while there are ongoing efforts to rearm these cells at sea, it's also important to note that in most circumstances, a ship will have to actually leave the fight and return to a friendly port in order to rearm these cells once their weapons have been launched. The Navy's largest surface combatants, its handful of remaining Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers, pack 2 61-cell vertical launch systems for a total of 122 missile cells per ship. America's most modern destroyers, the Flight 3 Arleigh Burkes, carry 32 cells in their forward VLS modules and 64 cells at the rear of the ship for a total of 96. And the 3 stealthy Zumwalt-class destroyers in service carry 80 Mark 57 VLS cells and are currently being retrofitted to carry another 12 hypersonic conventional prompt strike weapons and 4 larger launch tubes mounted forward on the ship. And the surface fleet's long-range strike capabilities are significantly bolstered by additional VLS cells provided by both Virginia-class attack subs and 4 heavily modified Ohio-class ballistic missile subs that have been converted into SSGNs, or guided missile submarines. Now, Block 5 Virginias will carry 40 missile cells each, but all in-service Virginias pack 12, while the 4 Ohio-class subs pack a whopping 154 cells each, more than any other ship in Navy service. It's tough to nail down a precise number for just how many total VLS cells the Navy has across its entire in-service fleet, but we can do some rough back-of-the-envelope math to give us an idea. The Navy's 7 remaining Ticonderoga-class cruisers provide a total of 854 cells. Its 28 Flight 1 and 2 Arleigh Burkes provide a total of 2,520 cells, while the 44 newer Flight 2A and Flight 3s carry more missiles and provide another 4,224 cells. So altogether, Arleigh Burkes combined provide around 6,744 cells. 3 Zumwalt-class destroyers give the Navy 240, while 24 Virginia-class attack subs provide 288. And finally, just 4 Ohio-class guided missile subs add another 616 cells to the Navy's total inventory. And altogether, this shakes out to around 8,742 total vertical launch missile cells across the entire United States Navy, distributed among roughly 110 surface ships and submarines. But there is a problem. The Navy's 7 remaining Ticonderogas and 4 Ohio-class guided missile subs are all Cold War relics slated to retire by 2030. And combined, that represents the loss of nearly 17% of the Navy's entire VLS arsenal, or roughly 1,470 vertical launch tubes lost. And until recently, the Navy intended to help offset this loss by fielding a large number of new small surface combatants, frigates, armed with the same sensor suite as larger destroyers and packing 32 vertical launch system cells each, along with a towed sonar array and very quiet propulsion system for anti-submarine warfare. Initial plans called for building 20 of these Constellation-class frigates, with longer-term plans to potentially produce as many as 38 more in an updated Flight 2 iteration. Those first 20 ships would offset about 40% of the Navy's lost firepower and, importantly, would distribute it across more ships, making it possible to be in more places at once, and just as importantly, reducing the risks associated with individual losses. Or, in other words, if all your missiles are packed into one large ship, they can only be in one place at a time, and that ship doesn't even need to be sunk to take all those weapons out of the fight. All you really need to do is hit its sensors, and then all that firepower has no means of finding a target. By distributing weapons across a larger number of smaller ships, as the Navy has long planned to do, not only could you be in more places at once, but any ship lost in the fight would only represent a small portion of overall combat capacity. But as we all know by now, the Constellation-class program soon became a case study in scope creep, with Naval Sea Systems Command reportedly trying to cram so many capabilities into these little ships that the effort soon went completely off the rails, resulting in the first ship of the class being delayed by at least 3 years, and of course, the program's announced cancellation just a few weeks ago. Last week, the Navy announced the Constellation-class's replacement, a new, as-yet-named class of frigate that will be based directly on the Coast Guard's much smaller but very capable Legend-class national security cutter. And to be honest, that really could be a solid plan. Production of the Legend class did see its own long list of design changes and delays and cost overruns, eventually even leading to the cancellation of what was to be the 11th and final vessel of the production run. But one could argue that means the Coast Guard has sort of already funded and overcome all of the most painful aspects of development. The ships themselves, which have been in service since 2008, have proven extremely capable on the open ocean. And while this would mean the Navy's new frigate would come in at around 78 feet shorter and nearly 2,600 tons lighter than the Constellation, it could still be a boon for the Navy as long as production didn't stall, the price stayed right, and of course, it carries the vertical launch system cells that the Navy so desperately needs. Even a smaller vessel could still accommodate the 32 cells meant for the Constellation, and it is worth noting that there was even some debate as to whether 32 cells was enough. So as long as this new frigate can pack those cells in, it could be a very solid approach to getting out from under the Connie class's ballooning costs and delays. But then, literally just a few hours ago as I record this, the War Zone confirmed with the Navy that the first flight, or version of this new frigate, will come armed with 0 vertical launch system cells. Instead, a Navy spokesperson said the first flight of new frigates will be armed with only a 57mm gun, 2 30mm guns, and a Mark 49 rolling airframe missile launcher for short-range air defense, while leaving room to accommodate, quote, containerized payloads. According to those sources who spoke to the war zone, the goal is to get these ships into the water as soon as possible and then make design revisions for later versions of the ship to accommodate other mission types down the road. They also emphasized that these vessels would serve as motherships for various drone assets that are currently in development and testing. And this is what I mean when I say that it sort of sounds like the Navy is getting simple solutions to complicated problems. Solutions that were born out of spreadsheets rather than battlefield reality. Now, they're absolutely right that the Navy desperately needs more ships. With more vessels sailing into retirement than are being christened each year, America's Navy is actually shrinking, while China's continues to grow. But this ship problem isn't just about ships, it's about the combat capacity that they deliver. Without VLS cells, these new frigates would probably struggle to defend themselves against the growing variety of airborne threats that they would face in a high-end fight. And worse, they'll offer next to no offensive capabilities at all against long-range targets. Now, don't get me wrong, these ships could still be able to do the sort of interdiction, policing, and coastal operations as their Coast Guard siblings, but not really much else. At the end of the day, it's basically just still a Coast Guard cutter. And what that ultimately means is spending somewhere between $600 million and $1 billion per new frigate that will offer little to no offensive capability, can't be used to ease the air defense burden on destroyers, and that rely on drone systems that have yet to manifest to even give it a reason to join the fight. But then maybe that was the impetus behind the new Trump-class battleship, which would indeed provide a big boost in offensive firepower, including those incredibly strategically important VLS cells. But to be honest, it seems pretty unlikely to me that these ships really could be the answer that the Navy is looking for, let alone the answer that the Navy needs. As we said at the top, each Trump-class battleship is meant to carry 128 Mark 41 VLS cells, just 6 more than each outgoing Ticonderoga-class cruiser. Now that means it would take 12 Trump-class battleships just to offset the number of VLS cells that the Navy is losing in the next 4 years. And each of those battleships are expected to cost about the same to build as a Ford-class aircraft carrier at an estimated $10 to $15 billion for the first ship of the class, the USS Defiant. Now, all told, that could mean spending a relatively conservative $120 billion to field the same number of missile cells that we have in service today, but distributed among fewer ships that can be in fewer places at once. And cost isn't the only place where these new battleships would share the modern woes of aircraft carriers. For years now, some have argued that the era of aircraft carriers is already at an end simply because they are massive warships packed to the brim with combat capability and capacity, making them multi-billion-dollar, 1,000-foot targets that are well worth the effort and the cost of destroying. Now, protecting these carriers from airborne threats is among the primary responsibilities of the destroyers and, for now, cruisers sailing as a part of the carrier strike group. And let there be no doubt, these ships, equipped with the Aegis combat system and a variety of interceptors, are easily among the most advanced and capable air defense assets that this world has ever seen. But there is a reason carriers still take evasive action when even dated Houthi anti-ship missiles are bearing down on them. It's that no air defense system, no matter how good, is infallible. And even if a system were to be perfect, every air defense asset ever devised still has what we commonly call a saturation point, or the point in which there are just too many threats coming for the system to engage, either because of targeting limitations or just because you ran out of interceptors. War games played out by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, for instance, repeatedly showed the United States winning a fight with China, but still losing one, if not two, aircraft carriers in just the initial days of the fight, thanks to their massive long-range missile stockpiles and this simple saturation arithmetic. And Trump-class battleships would be no different. Even if we somehow armed these battleships with interceptors that had a 100% success rate, all China needs to do is launch one more missile than the battleship carries interceptors to get right through those defenses. But to be clear, the Navy could indeed find lots of viable use cases for the first batch of frigates delivered with little in the way of offensive capabilities, and subsequent production runs could resolve that offensive problem. Likewise, battleship-led ship formations could provide a powerful deterrent message to adversaries in much the same way a carrier strike group does today. And in the fight, its large, short and long-range arsenals could both be very, very handy. These sorts of programs aren't just good or bad, they're complex systems that can be used in a variety of different ways and may even see their worth manifest in ways that we have yet to predict. The most reasonable debates surrounding these shipbuilding decisions, then, aren't necessarily about what capabilities they can deliver, so much as what capabilities the Navy could get by allocating the funding and resources to other endeavors that are more in keeping with the force's real battlefield needs. For years now, the Navy's been working to field a more distributed fleet of smaller, broadly capable warships that leverage advanced sensors and mature weapon technologies to fight well above their weight class and on a budget. And while the Navy's acquisition process in doing so is, well, it's objectively broken, this sudden shift toward lightly armed frigates and heavily armed battleships still seems like a bit of a step backward rather than forward. Likewise, Navy officials have pretty consistently highlighted the need for a new long-range strike fighter capable of operating off of its flat tops as among the branch's most pressing needs and highest priorities. China's stockpile of long-range anti-ship ballistic and hypersonic missiles now have more reach than the Navy's carrier fighters, meaning the Navy needs longer-ranged jets to avoid the carrier losses that they repeatedly incurred in those war games I just mentioned. This new fighter, being developed under the name FAXX, has development routes that stretch back a decade now, and was meant to see a production contract awarded this year, allowing for the jet to be developed and produced in sufficient numbers to replace today's FA-18 Super Hornets when they begin to age out of service in the 2030s. But this year saw the Navy fighter program budget slashed by 84% instead. The FAXX program is now held until after the Air Force's new stealth fighter, Boeing's F-47, emerges from development. Navy officials and lawmakers on both sides of the aisle have repeatedly called for the FAXX program to be funded, with even Senator Mitch McConnell describing it as necessary to ensure, quote, the aircraft carrier remains America's premier power projection platform for decades. To put it all really simply, the Navy asked for a small surface combatant that can provide air defense support for its carrier strike groups or conduct offensive missions all on its own, and instead, they're getting a lightly armed Coast Guard cutter that can't really do either, at least in its current form. The Navy asked for a new long-range carrier fighter that can ensure its most precious assets, its multi-billion-dollar carriers themselves, can operate without risk of being sank in a high-end fight, and instead, it's getting battleships that only offer a bit more offensive strike capability than today's Ticonderoga-class cruisers. America's new frigates and battleships could ultimately provide the U.S. Navy with vital capabilities in a future fight. And I want to be clear that it isn't that I think there's no value to be derived from either of these vessels. But for the literally hundreds of billions of dollars being invested into these programs, I can't help but wonder if we might be better off giving the Navy what they've said they've needed all along, rather than what squares away the Pentagon's spreadsheets. But hey, I could certainly be wrong. I've been wrong before and I will be again, so I'd like to hear what you guys think. Are these new warships just what the Navy needs to get back on track, or are they little more than the next in a long line of short-sighted warship programs that ultimately get the axe after just a handful of holes have been delivered? Are new battleships more valuable than keeping carrier strike groups viable in a high-end fight? And am I underestimating just how handy lightly armed drone-packing frigates really could be in that same conflict? I know you guys are smart, and I am happy to have my mind changed, so let me hear what you got to say. And also let me know if you want a deeper dive into this new frigate program, because I actually already wrote it. I just pivoted to discussing both of these ships when the Battleship announcement dropped last night. So, with that ends yet another edition of Firepower from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and now merch from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.